Hi everyone, this video is part 4 and 5 of Unit 7. I will cover in this video the introduction to personality, and so those topics are on this slide. I'll just kind of condense them and talk about them as the introduction to personality and just a historical look at the studies and the research that has gone into personality. So, to start with, personality can be defined as just understanding the individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we're all really unique. And so with personality research, it's just finding out collective ideas on those things. So those traits that kind of define our personality. So a case study is one method of trying to understand personality, and a case study would be where you'd look at one individual in depth, and then you'd take the information you gathered about that individual, and then you'd make an inference about a greater population, a bigger population based on that one individual. A survey would be a method of collecting information or data on an individual or group of individuals where you have questions and then you have that individual report to you their answers to the questions. An example of a survey method would be a personality inventory. And a personality inventory is this self-report questionnaire. Typically, there are a set of questions and there are answers that the individual can select their response to. And the goal is then to collect information about their interests, their feelings, their behaviors, and the goal is then to create this personality profile about the person and their lifestyle. The last topic on this slide is projective tests, and this is another way to gain information about a person's personality. This is one that's probably less familiar to students. Most students are familiar with personality inventories, but a projective test is a test where an individual is given a stimulus, typically a visual image, and then they are to talk about that image, and the goal is for that person to project their inner thoughts and feelings onto that image, and then the psychologist or psychiatrist would gather that information through them projecting their thoughts and feelings onto that image. An example of this would be an ink blot test. Next, we're going to go into the history. So backing up into the studies of personality that began the earliest, and we're going to start with Freud. Freud we look at as more of a historical approach to personality. Some of his ideas have maintained into contemporary ideas, but for the most part, Freud's ideas, we talk about them just kind of as the historical foundation for personality research. So Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis, and this is a perspective of psychology that focuses on the unconscious mind, and that this is what drives our thoughts and feelings, these things that we're just not aware of in our mind. And so that is the premise of psychoanalysis. And Sigmund Freud would say the unconscious mind is just a place that we house our unacceptable thoughts and feelings and desires and drives and our memories that for whatever reason we maybe they're painful or they're unacceptable, and so they're just back there and we just don't even know they're there and they're driving us. And so Freud would use methods of psychotherapy to try to pull out those unconscious thoughts and feelings, and one of those methods was free association. And free association was a method he would use in therapy where he would have his patient sit and recline on this chaise, and he would sit behind them and he would just ask them to talk about anything that comes to mind. And his goal was to pull out, and he would tell them it doesn't matter how trivial or how embarrassing, just whatever comes to mind. And his hope was to have them talk freely and to make these associations with some of the things that came out of their thoughts, to hopefully that he could tap into their unconscious. So he would be listening for the manifest content, the story of what they were saying, the storyline. And he would hope to tap into the latent content, the hidden meaning that they were unaware of. He would also do this through dream interpretation, and he would also do this through hypnosis. And the goal was to tap into that latent or hidden meaning within all of it. Now, out of this came ideas about personality. So Freud believed that there were 3 elements of personality: the id, ego, and superego. And these 3 elements are all in battle with one another in a person's mind. The id would develop first as through childhood, and the id is the part of your personality that you're not aware of, but it's pushing you to gratify your desires, your basic drives, and your aggressive feelings, and it wants you to act on impulse. This is what he would say is part of your personality that's trying to just satisfy its pleasures. He would say the pleasure principle, and so it's pushing you, don't even know it. You have on the other spectrum of your personality the superego. If you think of the superhero as always doing what is right. And the superego develops later as children start to internalize moral ideals and what is right and wrong. And the superego is the part of your personality that you're not necessarily aware of that's pushing you to do what's right or what's socially acceptable. And your ego is operating in reality and it's trying to mediate between the urges of the id and the pushing of the superego. And this is all going on in your mind. And these are these inner conflicts between your id and your superego, and your ego is trying to mediate between all of those. And so that would be what he would say would make up your inner personality. Freud also says that your personality develops in stages, and so he has created the psychosexual stages of development, and this is largely historical as well. So as you're listening to this, you might think, well, this is strange, and it is. But this is where Freud came up with where adults are struggling in some of their areas. He would say they're fixating on these stages of early childhood that they had a conflict in and they can't seem to get out of it. They're fixating. And so all of these stages focus on some kind of sexual aspect that is developing throughout childhood. And this is where people critique Freud. Many people, critics of Freud, feel like his focus is too much on sexual development, especially in these early ages in childhood. But Freud stages. He would say that young infants are moving through an oral stage when they are moving through their infant development, and they're focused on their mouth and sucking and biting and chewing and all of these things. Now, if they enter some kind of conflict in this stage as an adult, they might be fixated here, and they might, if an adult is having some habit that they can't break of, chewing on things or smoking, he would say, well, they have a fixation in that early childhood stage, the oral stage. He would say then toddlers move into the anal stage. This is where they're focused on their bowels and, that sort of thing, bowels and bladder and eliminating your bowels and bladder. And so he would say there's this struggle for like controlling their biological processes, and this can cause a fixation in adulthood if they don't overcome this. Into preschool and into elementary age, they're going through the phallic stage where they're understanding that they have genitalia, and Freud would say this stage of development, they're noticing that they are a girl or they're a boy, and they're noticing those biological differences, and this could cause fixation in adulthood as well. And through this stage, this is all unconscious. So he would say this is all something they're not aware of. He would say little boys in this stage are going through the Oedipus complex, where they are in this competition for their mother's love, and they're competing against their father. And he created this idea, or developed this idea, through a case study with a boy named Little Hans and a correspondence he had with Little Hans's father. And so this was developed off of a case study. And again, people would critique this, and they would say that this case study doesn't necessarily represent a whole population. The Electra complex is the same idea, but for girls. Freud would say that the girls are in competition for their father's love with their mother. They're in competition with their mother to gain the attention of their father, and that is the phallic stage. After the phallic stage, Freud says that children go through a latent stage where they have all this hidden sexual desire until they enter puberty. And when they enter puberty and on and through adulthood, they're in the genital stage where they are developing their sexual interest and maturing through that stage. And so this is the psychosexual stages of development. Freud would also say that part of people's personalities are defense mechanisms, and there are people today who still hold on to some of these principles of defense mechanisms. So this is one of a more lasting concept from Sigmund Freud. So defense mechanisms, Freud would say, are coping mechanisms to deal with stress and anxiety, and he would say it's the ego that's trying to deal with the stress and anxiety of the id and the superego that are trying to pull you in these different directions, and you have these anxious tensions, and the defense mechanisms are trying to get you to cope with that. So I'm going to cover a couple of these. I would suggest for you to pause this and look at the definitions and examples. You might have to zoom in a little bit, but I'll just cover a couple. Repression is a defense mechanism where you're going through this anxiety, this stress of unacceptable feelings, and you just push it away. You just don't even think about it. You just push it out of your mind into the unconscious. Regression is where you're having these unacceptable or stressful anxiety feelings, and you just revert to some kind of infantile stage. You throw a tantrum to try to cope with that. Projection might be where you're trying to cope, and rather than deal with your own anxieties, you just project it onto somebody else. You accuse them of the feelings you're having yourself. Rationalization, you're justifying. Denial is obviously you're just not believing that whatever was going on, this painful reality, you just disbelieve it. And so these are just some of the defense mechanisms that Freud would say you use to cope with the stress and anxiety that you have. Now, I've been talking about Freud. He developed psychoanalysis. So there are lots of criticisms of psychoanalysis. People who still hold on to some of his ideas of the unconscious mind and some of the principles that he has would be called psychodynamic. And if you think of something dynamic being fluid, that might help you think of people who have changed and moved away from some of his ideas but still kept some of his ideas. And that's how I remember psychodynamic theories. These are people who still find the importance in the unconscious mind, but they don't hold to a lot of Freud's other ideas, or they critique him in some other way. So here are some of those people. One is Carl Jung, and Carl Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud. You can see here's Freud and here's Jung, and Carl Jung is younger, and he was a collaborator on different things, but he did critique Freud in different ways. He also had some of his own ideas that he contributed to psychology. One of those ideas of personality studies was the idea of introversion and extroversion. Introversion being a personality trait in which someone is not as outgoing, they're more inward focused, whereas extroversion is someone who is socially outgoing and they like to be a part of these social gatherings, whereas introversion would be more to themselves. Collective unconscious was an idea that is definitely this idea that's wrapped in the unconscious, but Jung brought this idea that we actually pass down traits of our unconscious to our children, and that as a human race, we have a collective unconscious, and that we have archetypes, that we have symbols that we have within us that we pass on to our children, and these are unconscious symbols. So one archetype would be mothers. Having this symbol, we pass it down to our children, and our children have this desire or understanding of what a mother is. Now, as they develop, they're going to have their own experience with what a mother is, but it's this unconscious symbol that we move on to our children. And the collective unconscious is just meaning that we have, as a group of people, we have a shared unconscious that we pass down to our children. Next is Hermann Rorschach, and Hermann Rorschach lived during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. He died at an early age. He died at age 37, but he made huge contributions to psychology. So he was a psychoanalyst, so he believed in Freud's ideas of the unconscious mind, and his hope was to create a way for people to tap into that and understand just the emotional well-being of people, and he used this through the Rorschach ink blot test. So he created these ink blots that would be used as a stimuli for people to talk about. And so he would display ink blots, and he would show a person these ink blots. He would have them use free association, and he'd also have this inquiry phase where he would ask them about these ink blots, and his hope was that he could get them to project their inner feelings through their conversation of these ink blots, and then he could then understand more of their personality and their emotional well-being. Next is another type of projective test that was created and used in the early 1900s, and this was a thematic appreception test. And this particular test is a test where a person is asked, just like with the ink blot test, to tell a story, but this one would be like you would talk about the characters in this image. And then based on how you talked about the characters in the image, the psychologist or psychiatrist would then infer your inner feelings based on your projection of this storyline between the characters in the image. All right, our last psychodynamic psychologist is Alfred Adler, and Alfred Adler is a neo-Freudian, so he takes some of those same ideas but then has some critiques. Alfred Adler is most well known for his ideas of how society has shaped people unconsciously, but also he focuses on the individual. He believed that birth order affected personality, but also your your feelings of inferiority, and that you strived for superiority and you strived for those things in your personality. And so this was the history of personality research, and it was also just a quick look into the introduction to personality. The next video will cover more contemporary ideas of personality as far as trait theories go, humanistic ideas of psychology, and testing. I hope this was helpful.